Russia is increasing its military presence at Ukraine's borders. In response, President Biden says the U.S. would impose new sanctions if Russia takes further military action. Stephen Pifer was U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and is now a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. Ambassador, welcome to the program.
Morning. How are you doing today?
What do we know about the recent phone call between President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin? Has there been any change on Moscow's part as a result of that call?
Yes. Well, in the phone call last week, as in the phone call earlier in December, it looks like President Biden tried to do two things. Was one, lay out a series of costs for Russia in terms of sanctions, more military assistance to Ukraine, and a deeper NATO military presence on NATO's eastern flank. Those would be costs to Russia if Russia goes militarily into Ukraine, but also trying to point out that there is a path to dialogue and diplomacy. And so we've had those conversations. There will be sets of meetings next week, a US-Russia meeting, a NATO-Russia meeting, and a meeting of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And that may give us an indication of how much impact the president's conversations have had in terms of affecting the Kremlin's course.
What is Russia asking for from the US and from NATO?
Well, what Russia's asked for, they've proposed two draft agreements, a draft US-Russia agreement and a draft NATO-Russia agreement. There are a number of provisions in those agreements that are simply non-starters. For example, they ask NATO to forswear any more enlargement. They ask NATO to withdraw all troops and the small numbers of troops that have been deployed on the new members that joined the alliance after 1997. And those provisions are not likely to get any traction with NATO. But there are some elements talking about perhaps establishing new communications channels, a discussion about some limitations on military activities that, if applied in a reciprocal basis, if the Russians were prepared to also respond to American and NATO concerns, might provide a basis for some discussion and even a negotiation. But we don't know that.
And why is Russia choosing right now to escalate the situation? What are they hoping to gain?
Well, I believe the current crisis is first and foremost about Russia's concern about losing Ukraine. You've had this military buildup by the Russian military near Ukraine's borders now for more than 2 months. And there seems to be a concern in Moscow that they are on the verge of irretrievably losing Ukraine. Now, the big reason for this is, of course, Russian actions over the past 8 years, the seizure of Crimea, Russian involvement in a conflict in Donbass that's cost more than 13,000 lives. Russian policy has had the effect of pushing Ukraine away from Russia, and you have growing interest in Ukraine in joining institutions such as the European Union and NATO, which Ukrainians more and more see as vital for Ukraine's security. So the crisis, while the agreements that Russia put forward last month frame it as a crisis between Russia and NATO, I think it's really about Ukraine.
I know, Mr. Ambassador, that your experience is with the State Department, but what about sending weapons and military supplies to Ukraine? Is that already happening?
That has been happening. In fact, it goes back to 2014, and including in the last 4 years, it's included lethal military assistance such as Javelin anti-armor missiles. And I believe that this is something that the United States and other NATO countries should be doing. It seems pretty clear that NATO is not going to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. You're not going to see NATO combat troops in Ukraine. But the United States and other European countries should be doing what they can to help the Ukrainians better defend themselves. And to the extent that they provide that kind of assistance, that may help deter and dissuade Russia from launching a new assault on Ukraine.
And what's the capability right now for Ukraine to defend itself?
Well, the Ukrainian military is substantially better than it was in 2014. It's twice as large. It has a significant number of personnel who have military experience. They've faced off against Russian and Russian proxy forces along the line of contact in eastern Ukraine. And there's several 100,000 veterans. So they're even talking now about preparations for a partisan guerrilla warfare if the Russians come in. But I think it's probably still pretty clear that the Russian military in the end would be able to defeat the Ukrainian military, but the Ukrainians would be able to extract a price. And that may be the biggest thing holding the Russians back, is that while on the one hand, taking a very strong view internationally plays well for the Kremlin with the Russian public, I don't believe that lots of dead Russian soldiers are going to be very popular.
And finally, President Biden has said that the U.S. would impose sanctions if Russia attacked. How painful would those sanctions be to Russia, and how would they likely respond?
Administration officials say that the sanctions would be dramatically more painful to Russia than anything that's been imposed to date. And people who are smarter about sanctions than me say that on a scale of 1 to 10, we're only at about a level of maybe 3 to 3.5 in terms of sanctions on Russia. So there are things that can happen. For example, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that has now been completed but not yet certified, I believe that that's a dead issue if the Russians go into Ukraine militarily. Either the German government will kill it, or if the German government does not, then I believe the Biden administration will no longer waive sanctions on the pipeline. So I think there's a significant degree of pain. And it's interesting that the Russians for the last 7 years take this attitude that we don't care about it, Western sanctions. They really don't have an impact.
But they really do, don't they?
They really do. If you look at the readout, the Russian readout of the phone call, the last phone call between the two presidents, it says that it was made clear to President Biden that if there are American sanctions, that could lead to a rupture in U.S.-Russia relations. The Russians care about sanctions.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for being on the program. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.